Hello and welcome to this series of revision videos for the OCR A-Level French Revolution topic. This is the first in a series of lessons which are going to be focused on the causes of the Revolution of 1789. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at absolutism and the structure of the Ancien regime. There's a lot of information on the slides that follow. I've tried to put emphasis on kind of the words in bold, which are the things you must know to kind of attain a really high grade in your exam. But as I'm obviously presenting, I will highlight what I also think is really, really important as well, just to kind of guide your note taking. So let's start then. An introduction to absolutism in France. So absolutism means where the king has full power, and the French people at the time believed that the king's power, so King Louis XVI, his power came from God, so it was derived from God. And this was a speech given by Chrétien François de Lamoignon, who was the Minister of Justice in the Paris Parliament in 1787. And I just want to show you this just as a good introduction to the topic. So he says, sovereign power in his kingdom belongs to the king alone. He is accountable only to God for the exercise of supreme power. So that kind of idea of absolute power. The link that unites the king and the nation is by nature indissoluble. The shared interests and duties of the king and his subjects ensure an everlasting union. So I'll pause there. If you want to read it on, the rest you can by yourself. But what this really captures is the relationship, obviously, between the king and God, but also some kind of really interesting insights into the relationship between the king and his people. Although the king does have full power, there are certain expectations that he needs to kind of uphold and certain things he needs to do. So that brings us on to Louis XVI as king. Now the key thing to be aware of is Louis XVI was not always expected to be king. In fact, his brother died, which then left him as the Dauphin, or the prince who is going to inherit the throne in 1765. He then marries the very unpopular Marie Antoinette. She is Austrian. And that was done in 1770 to reconcile the two countries who had been fighting for some time. Now, Louis himself spends more time hunting and dining and enjoying feasts rather than reforming France. And Marie is also just as disinterested. So famously, she had a little hamlet constructed in Versailles, and she would pretend most days to be a farmer and enjoying a more simple life rather than caring for her subjects. And her lavish lifestyle eventually earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. Okay, so let's start to think then about the kind of how royal power was used in France. So the court is an incredibly important kind of area in French society, and when we're looking at French government. Now the court factions, so different groups within court, would each try and kind of campaign to get support from the king. There was an extreme emphasis on manners and etiquette, so kind of when to kneel at the right time, when to speak at the right time, kind of greetings. They were very deferential, which means that they were very kind of subservient and saw the king as a higher power. And then there was also the famous event of the royal levee, which is the king's waking, which was a kind of a routine around the king waking up. And this shows again the importance of etiquette and manners and routines in the court. The key thing to draw your attention, though, is that each court faction would try and kind of gain support from the king. So that might be in the form of a pension, a sinecure, a contract, or a gratuity. Okay, so they're all trying to kind of compete for extra wealth and extra power. That's not to say, though, that encroaches upon Louis's power. Louis's power is, in theory, absolute. So he has the right to the lettre de cachette, and that's a letter in which the king could order imprisonment. And that had been abused under the reign of Louis XV, who obviously preceded Louis XVI. So even before Louis XVI takes the throne, there's already been quite a bad history in terms of how power was used. The king, in theory, could do as he pleased, but he does have to follow certain customs and conventions. So he has to uphold the religion of the country, which was Christianity, specifically Catholicism, and he also had to protect his subjects. I'm just going to highlight that because that shows us that the relationship is a two-way one. Okay, so he has duties to his people, and if he is not doing that, then he's failing as a so in terms of the Ancien regime and how the government works, I just want to talk about kind of local government more. So the people enforcing the king's will in the local region was actually the intendant. and they were appointed by the king to rule over local regions. So they're a bit like civil servants, but they'd actually be in charge of local areas. And these are the duties that they'd have to do. So taxes, okay, they'd be making sure that people were paying their taxes, enforcing the king's laws, local courts, so enforcing the law as well, and then also coordinating the prévôt, which is the police force. Now the issue is, this all sounds all good and well, but the issue is the intendant practiced venality, and that was an example of corruption. So venality, which comes from the French meaning to sell, was where administrative offices would be sold. So by the 18th century, there were 70,000 venal offices, and people were not being promoted on merit or how hard they worked, but by whether they were able to buy these offices. So the intendants were not necessarily the best people for the job, but people who were quite wealthy and were able to buy as many offices as possible. Now the issue with this is you're not getting the best people doing the job because they're not being promoted. There's just about who's got the most money. The other problem is that a lot of these posts might be absent, or someone might hold multiple posts, so they might have a plurality of posts, which again would lead to further corruption, and it would mean the Ancien regime would not be able to function properly. Okay, the French Revolution clears this away. If you think about people like Napoleon, for example, he's able to rise and be promoted because of his hard work and his success, rather than how much money he has. In terms of local government and kind of how it works in more detail, so you'd have provincial governors who were drawn from the Second Estate, and they would be responsible for France's historic provinces, and there was 39 of them in total. And they could call what is known as a provincial parliament. We'll talk about that in a second. In the countryside, it's slightly different. The landowning nobles, so the seigneurs, they're the ones who have the most influence. Okay, so the intendants don't really have that much sway, and the seigneurs, so the people who own the land, would run their own courts. Okay, so there's lots of corruption going on in the countryside. And then in terms of France, kind of how it's divided regionally, we have 6 areas known as the Pays d'État. Now these are the older historic parts of France, and they have lots of privileges, so they can negotiate the amount of taxation they have to pay to the crown. They have powerful assemblies as well, and they kind of rule with the intendant. Now the newly conquered areas, or the areas that had been recently attached to France, they're known as the Pays d'Élection, and they don't have those privileges. So again, you can see that France is not a consistent system at this time. It's what is known as a patchwork, and there's different systems going on in different regions, which is just going to contribute to even more tension. So let's think about the Parlement then, because I've mentioned them. So at the highest level, there were 13 Parlements, and essentially they're just courts in the land, okay? They're at the top of the court system. At the bottom of the court system, there are bailliage courts, which you don't necessarily need to know about unless you're going for the A-star. Now, it's the job of the Parlement to hear the most serious civil and criminal cases, okay? So they're not dealing with just petty crime, they're dealing with the most important crimes in the region. They would also control the guilds, which are a bit like unions, but control labour. So you could only become, for example, a carpenter if you were part of the carpentry guild. And they also control corporations and markets. So they also come into regular conflict with the intendant. In terms of their relationship with the king, they can also use their influence to challenge the king's power. So the first thing is that they could issue a remonstrance, or a droit de remonstrance, which is the right to protest. So they can protest against the king's laws. They're pretty much the only organisation in France which can formally do this at this point. They can also block the legislation. So if they were to protest through a remonstrance, that legislation would then be blocked, and the king would have to override it using a lit de justice, which is a formal session. And what would happen is he would call the Paris Parlement, and there'd be a formal routine or procedure in which he then basically enforced his law. Now, as you can tell, the fact that he'd have to do that formally is an embarrassing occasion for the king, especially if he has to do it regularly. So the kings of France would always try and avoid a lit de justice. It's usually the last resort. Now, from 1763 onwards, there had been a lot of tension between the Parlement and Louis XVI. And in fact, Louis XV, and Louis XV had even tried to abolish the Parlement in 1771, okay? Which is a really good fact that you can use in your exam if you're talking about the growing power of the Parlement. In terms of the Parliament, they were manned by 12 magistrates, and they were part of the noblesse de robe. Okay, so they're not in terms of the distinction, the noblesse de robe are men who have recently become nobles, and they become nobles through their hard work and they've bought their position. The noblesse de l'épée are men of royal blood, and they are basically related to the king usually. Okay, so they're people who have been noblemen for centuries. Their families are very well known and established. They are not the people who run the Parlement. It's the noblesse de robe who run the Parlement. Okay, so be aware of that as well. In terms of divisions within society, this is the last bit we're going to cover in this video. So by the 1780s, France has seen a lot of overpopulation. There's 27 million people living in the country, which is a huge amount for the time. And they're divided into 3 estates. Now, an estate is just another word for a class, basically. So the first class are the clergy, and there's 150,000 of them. And the second class, or the second estate, are the nobility, and there's 400,000 of them. The first and second estate are generally what we would call like upper class. So a lot of the time they are royal, they are quite wealthy, they have certain privileges, which we'll talk about in a second. Although it's not always the case. So some of the first estate were quite poor. Now the third estate includes everyone else, so that can include the homeless person on the streets, all the way up until a very wealthy factory owner or a very successful lawyer, merchant, banker. So the third estate includes everyone else, over 95% of French society. So the first estate, let's think about them in more detail. So some of they have to obviously conduct religious duties because they're part of the church, but they're an incredibly wealthy group. So because of the tithe, they receive quite a lot of income, and they are incredibly wealthy. They own 10% of the land in France, in some areas more so than others. And the top members of the first estate are drawn directly from the second estate. So they're drawn from the ranks of the nobility, especially the noblesse de l'épée, and they live a very lavish lifestyle. Whereas the bottom of the first estate, they've got more in common with your average man from the third estate. And the key privilege that they have is that they're not required to pay the tithe. Instead, they pay a don gratuit, which translates to a free gift. And that's basically where they would decide how much they were going to pay in tax. So often it would just be, a nominal amount. It wouldn't be a huge amount, and it would fluctuate. So some years they'd be like, well, we've done a lot in terms of our religious duties. We're not going to pay that much to the king. And the king would just have to accept that. He wouldn't be able to enforce their payment of a certain amount. We then come on to the second estate, so the nobility. They are very powerful, so they own between 20 to 25% of French land. A lot of them don't work, so they would live off their rents from the land. The noblesse de l'épée are the hereditary nobility, and they're allowed to wear a sword. They're very wealthy. They include the princes of the blood. The noblesse de robe are of lower status, and they basically recently joined the ranks of nobility through the 17th and 18th centuries, and they are numbering more than 70,000 by 1789. Both groups, though, nonetheless, even the noblesse de robe, they still look down on the members of the third estate who are trying to make their money from the new kind of expanding industries of business and trade. And they also don't pay the tithe, so the land tax. The tithe is just another word. It's just the French word for land tax. Divisions within society. Final part is the third estate. Now, the third estate are very, very split. So we have the wealthiest section. So they would range from merchants to lawyers. And they're usually men who've made their money from trade, skills, or professions. Whereas the rest of them, the majority of French society, are not wealthy at all. Okay, so usually unskilled workers or peasants, and they were basically kind of attached to their seigneur, so the landlord in the countryside. And only a small percentage of peasants actually owned their land. The rest of them would rent their land from the landlord, so the seigneur. The seigneurs can enforce their own taxes, so the champart or the right to use the mill or any other facility. So it can be ridiculous. It can be the right to graze your sheep at a certain time of the day, or the right to use the oven, or the right to collect chickens' eggs. All of these are examples of banalities which were enforced by the seigneurs and were imposed upon the French people. Now, the key thing about the third estate is that even though there is a big difference between the wealthiest and the poorest in the third estate, they are all united in their obligation to pay the tie and other forms of direct taxation. So the vingtième is like 20% on your income. So that was probably the second most hated tax. We've got the capitation, and then the other one you need to know is the gabelle, which is the salt tax. Okay. And every male member in the third estate was liable for military service and for unpaid labour, known as the corvée royale. So they'd have to spend maybe a day a week fixing French roads, and that would be unpaid. Okay. Now, the wealthiest members in society, some of them were able to get substitutes, so people who could fill their places. But for the most part, even the well-off had to do this, and this was imposed upon them, which obviously did not make them happy. Now, I just want to finish just by showing you an image of kind of what the third estate's life would have been like. And I've also just included a little extract from Arthur Young's travels, just if anybody wanted to have a read through about what life was like for the third estate. Just pause the video now. So that brings us to the end of our first video on the causes of the French Revolution. And then if you carry on watching the rest in the series, that will give you a very good insight of the content you need to know. Cheers. Now, this is how the government was organised and structured. So there was the Conseil d'État, which was the Council of State, and that dealt with major issues of state and foreign affairs. There's the Conseil de Dépêche, so that communicated with officials in the provinces. So the Conseil d'État is more about central power. The Conseil de Dépêche is more about local control. The Conseil Royal des Finances, or Finance, managed state finances. And then finally, the key things you need to be aware of are the chief ministers. So these are the people who would advise the king and would try and implement the king's will. And the most important one of them all was the controller general, who is in charge of the kingdom's finances. And we're going to see in a future video some of the key men associated with that role. In terms of for your exam, you must know the Conseil d'État, and I would also place some emphasis as well on just being aware of the difference between the Conseil d'État and the Conseil de Dépêche.